It always starts the same way. She looks at you not as you are, but as who she imagines you might become. The rooftop hummed with chatter and clinking glasses, but all of it faded when her eyes met his. There was a pause. Too long to be casual, too deliberate to be shy. She smiled, a slight tilt of her head, as though confirming a suspicion she'd long held. It wasn't seduction exactly. It was recognition, or at least that's what he told himself. Years from now, he'd remember that look not as a spark of connection, but as a projection. Not the warmth of being known, but the calculation of potential. She wasn't seeing him. She was measuring him, fitting him against a shape already outlined in her mind. He would remember and wonder why he didn't question it then. That night, it felt like everything changed. She approached him first, confident, purposeful. "You're different," she said, her tone rich with intrigue. "You seem like someone who's going somewhere." He laughed, unsure what she meant, but desperate to hold on to the feeling her words ignited. Different, seen, chosen. The trifecta every man secretly craves. He hadn't done anything remarkable. He stood quietly by the balcony, swirling the last sip of wine in his glass, watching the skyline like it might offer answers. But to her, that quietness wasn't stillness. It was mystery. And mystery, when misunderstood, becomes a blank canvas. One she couldn't wait to paint. So she painted. In the days that followed, her words wrapped around him like silk. "You're the kind of man who makes people feel safe. I bet you're the strong, silent type. I can see you doing something big." He heard admiration. What she was really doing was filling in the blanks. Each compliment a brushstroke, layering onto the image she was creating. Not of him, but for her. He began to perform without knowing, standing straighter, speaking more carefully, smiling when he wanted to be silent. He adjusted without question, eager to preserve her fascination. Because fascination felt like love, and love, or something that looked like it, was rare in a world that moved too fast to notice. In his solitude, he'd often dreamed of being chosen, not for what he had, but for who he was. Yet now that it seemed to be happening, a quiet unease pressed at the back of his mind. Something didn't quite fit. Her questions were never about his past, his pain, his philosophy. They were about what he might become. She was more curious about the future version of him than the man sitting across from her now. Late one evening, she whispered, "You could be amazing. You just need the right story." He didn't understand what she meant, but he nodded anyway. The more time they spent together, the more the lines blurred. His voice began to echo hers. His preferences softened, his edges rounded out. He stopped challenging her ideas, choosing instead to agree. Harmony felt easier than honesty. Agreement felt like affection. But deep down, something vital was retreating. Something real. The theater lights were still up, the crowd watching, the spotlight fixed. He didn't realize it, but he was already on stage. The casting had been done, the script handed over. He hadn't written a word of it. She had. And he was proud to be chosen, unaware that the man she wanted was not the man he was, but a role she believed he could play. But the masterpiece isn't you. It never was. You think you're being seen, but you're not. You're being measured, assessed. Mornings grew quieter in her apartment. The vibrant curiosity that once sparkled in her voice now arrived as questions with sharp edges. "Why don't you speak up more when we're out? Have you ever thought about being more assertive? She smiled as she asked, but her words came like gentle corrections to a manuscript, one she had already begun editing. He would lie in bed before sunrise, listening to the hum of her espresso machine, and wonder when the silence between them had become instructional. He still wanted to be chosen, but he now suspected he had only been cast. There's a difference between love and assignment, and slowly, he was beginning to feel like a project more than a person. She didn't argue with him. She adjusted him. Each morning, a new version of who he should be surfaced in the little things. A different shirt because this color makes you look stronger. A suggested book, so you can understand where I'm coming from better. At first, it felt like care. Then it started to feel like training. One overcast Saturday, he found her scribbling in a small notebook while he read on the couch. She didn't notice he was watching. Her pen moved swiftly, then paused, then scratched something out. He rose quietly and stepped into the kitchen, pretending to fetch a glass of water. But the look on her face, the furrowed focus, wasn't love. It was concentration. Blueprinting. That evening, after she went to shower, he glanced at the open notebook still resting on the table. It wasn't a diary. It was a list. A numbered breakdown of things he could improve. Needs to speak more confidently in public. Should take more initiative when making plans. Could benefit from a career shift. Something with leadership. Needs to be more emotionally present but less reactive. He closed the notebook gently, as if afraid the words might jump out and stain the room. Back on the couch, he sat with the growing understanding that he had stopped being a man and started being a silhouette, outlined by her ideas, filled in by her vision. They went out that night. She beamed as they entered the restaurant, proud of him. He wore the dark navy blazer she suggested, ordered the wine she preferred, laughed at the right intervals. She reached for his hand under the table and smiled. He smiled too, but the gesture felt like muscle memory, not emotion. He couldn't remember the last time he made a choice that hadn't already been rehearsed. Later, in bed, she nestled against him and whispered, "You're becoming everything I knew you could be." He said nothing. Because how do you respond when the person next to you doesn't realize they were not loving you, but a version of you they constructed to fit their ideal? He lay there, staring at the ceiling. A thought emerged. What happens when the script no longer fits? When the character refuses to say the lines? Does the story end? Or does she simply find a new actor? And when you stop fitting the script, she changes the actor, not the story. You confuse being desired with being known. It was a Thursday evening when they hosted friends for dinner, an event she orchestrated with practiced grace. The table was immaculate, candles flickered gently, and laughter echoed in curated waves. He played his part with precision. Charming, agreeable, offering anecdotes just daring enough to seem spontaneous, but never so real as to disrupt the mood. At one point, a guest leaned over and clapped him on the shoulder. "Man, you're the kind of guy every woman hopes to end up with." He smiled in return, accepting the compliment like a trophy handed to a man who never entered the race. Inside, the applause echoed hollow. He no longer recognized the man they admired. The stories he shared felt like reruns of a life he once believed in. His opinions mirrored the room. His laughter was timed, his gestures calculated. Not because he was insincere, but because he no longer remembered how to be anything else. She beamed beside him, placing her hand gently on his arm as if to affirm the performance. "You see?" her eyes seemed to say. "You're finally becoming the man I always knew you could be." But something twisted inside him. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the dishes were rinsed, he stood in the dim bathroom light staring into the mirror. The man who looked back wore the smile he'd trained for weeks to perfect. It was polished, warm, likable, and completely unfamiliar. He tried to frown. Even that looked like performance now. He leaned forward, bracing both hands against the sink, breathing slowly. The porcelain was cool beneath his palms, grounding. For a long moment he didn't move. Then quietly, to no one but his reflection, he said, "I don't know who I am anymore." His voice sounded foreign, like hearing someone else speak through his chest. He thought back to the things he used to enjoy, hiking alone at dawn, jazz records in a dusty corner of his apartment, reading philosophy under flickering lamplight. He hadn't done any of that in months, not because he didn't have time, but because he didn't remember he wanted to. The price of being chosen was becoming a stranger to himself. In the days that followed, He noticed how automatic he'd become. He complimented her outfits before she asked. He agreed with her takes on politics, art, even friendships he once questioned. He apologized before conflict ever surfaced, just to keep the waters still. And every morning he stared blankly into a mirror that reflected a man shaped by every desire but his own. At a cafe, he ran into an old friend who hadn't seen him in over a year. They hugged, shared pleasantries. Then the friend tilted his head. "You good?" he asked. "Of course," he replied. The friend didn't push, just nodded slowly. "All right, well, you look the part, I guess." And that was it. He walked home in silence, those words digging under his skin like splinters. You look the part. Not you seem well, not you're glowing, but you look the part. The part, the role, the mask. That evening, she told him she loved how steady he was, how predictable. She said it as a compliment, not realizing that steadiness born from suppression was not strength, it was survival. He nodded, smiled, kissed her forehead, and somewhere deep inside, another piece of him went silent. You stop being men and you start being masks. Jung taught that until a man embraces that solitude, he will never be free. He left without fanfare. No final argument, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet morning, her still asleep, his packed bag beside the door. The city hadn't woken yet. As he stepped outside, frost bit the air, and for the first time in months, his breath was his own. The drive to the cabin took 4 hours. It sat at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by bare trees and the whispering hush of snow. It wasn't much, just one room, a stove, a cot, but it felt like sanctuary. No service, no mirrors, no noise but the wind pressing against the windows like a memory trying to get back in. The silence was startling at first. He kept reaching for distractions that weren't there. Phone, music, her voice in his ear. He sat by the fire, blank notebook in hand, pen unmoving. For days, the page remained untouched. Then, in a drawer beneath the stove, he found an old book, Jung's collected writings. Underlined passages, dog-eared corners, margins full of questions written in someone else's hand. It was like discovering a lantern in a cave. He began to read, slowly at first, then hungrily. Lines leapt from the page as if aimed directly at the fracture in his chest. Individuation means becoming an individual, and insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, an incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. He sat with that sentence for an hour. Becoming one's own self. The absurdity of how far he drifted from that. At night, by the fire, he began talking aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to himself, to the man he abandoned, to the boy who used to dream without needing permission. He spoke of things he hadn't told her, things he hadn't even admitted to himself, regrets, fears, secret joys, quiet rebellions. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled, and snow pelted the windows like fists. He couldn't sleep. He paced the cabin, heart racing. It wasn't the storm outside that frightened him. It was the one unraveling inside. In the dim light of the wood stove, he caught his reflection in the cabin's small mirror. Pale, hollow-eyed, unshaven. But beneath the wear, something solid, something unflinching. He stared into his own gaze for minutes, hours maybe. Then, as if surfacing from deep water, he whispered, "I see you now." The mirror didn't answer, but for the first time, it didn't lie either. The next morning, he burned everything he had brought that wasn't essential. Old clothes she bought for him, a leather notebook filled with to-do lists for a life he no longer wanted. Even the last photograph of them together, where he smiled like a mannequin in a catalog. The fire cracked and danced as if pleased to be useful. He wrote that day, a letter, not to her, not even to his past self. A letter to no one, to the space within him, that had waited patiently to be reclaimed. He walked through the snow at dusk, breath steady, boots crunching over untouched paths. In the stillness of the woods, he didn't feel lonely. He felt returned. The cabin's mirror now reflected a man without decoration, without apology. He didn't look heroic. He didn't look strong. He looked real. He chose that, chose himself, not as a performance, not to prove anything, simply because there was no one left to choose for him. You become the author of your own reality. Individuation is lonely, terrifyingly lonely. The snow had begun to melt by the time he returned to the world. Not to the city, not to her, but to society's periphery, a small town with no questions and no expectations. He rented a modest room above a closed-down bookstore. The windows looked out onto a walking trail lined with fading autumn leaves. There, no one asked who he had been, only who he was now. Each morning, he walked the trail alone. He listened not to music, not to podcasts, but to the rhythm of his boots, the rustle of branches, the whisper of wind across skin. For the first time, silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. He passed couples sometimes, joggers, dog walkers. Occasionally they nodded. Some looked through him. One woman smiled with faint pity, as though assuming solitude was a condition, not a choice. One afternoon, he sat on a bench overlooking a frozen stream. A young man approached, early 20s, phone in hand, headphones around his neck. The stranger paused, looked at him, and scoffed. "You're one of those guys, huh?" he said. "Off the grid, all deep and mysterious. You think you're better than everyone?" The man didn't react. He simply looked up, met the stranger's eyes without malice, and said nothing. The young man shifted uncomfortably. "Whatever," he muttered, walking off. And still, he remained, unbothered. There was power in not needing to explain. Power in being misunderstood without flinching. In that moment he realized how often he used to edit himself for the comfort of others, how desperately he once tried to be palatable, agreeable, liked. Now, he didn't crave applause. He craved alignment, with truth, with presence, with himself. At night, he sat by a small fire pit behind the house, alone beneath the stars. The fire didn't ask him to speak. The sky didn't ask him to smile. The wind didn't care whether he was loved. He remembered his childhood, being afraid of being left behind, of being unchosen. How he used to mold himself to keep people close. Teachers, friends, women, anyone who would reflect back some image of worth. He thought that was connection. He thought that was love. But it wasn't. It was transaction, conditional, fleeting. The fire crackled beside him, its flame steady despite the chill. And he understood. The path he walked was not meant to be popular. It wasn't meant to be applauded. It was meant to be true. He whispered softly, "This is enough." Not because he had less, but because he finally understood what didn't matter. Some nights he missed her, not the woman, but the warmth of being seen, even if it was illusion. But he no longer confused affection with affirmation. He no longer needed to be needed. There's a sacred kind of freedom in no longer being defined by what others project. He still got looks. Some said he was too quiet, too serious, too strange. But he didn't flinch. He didn't perform. He didn't explain. He simply walked. You've stepped off the stage. You've stopped reading from their script. She won't flood you with grand declarations. She won't treat you like the missing piece of her puzzle. It was just another morning. The snow had returned. Not heavy, but soft, dusting the sidewalks like a quiet blessing. He sat alone in a small cafe at the edge of town, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. The window beside him fogged faintly with each exhale. He wasn't waiting for anyone. That was the difference now. He no longer entered spaces hoping to be noticed. She walked in without ceremony. No dramatic music. No slow-motion gaze. Just a woman ordering tea. settling into the quiet like someone who had made peace with silence. Her presence didn't demand the room's attention, but it somehow shifted its rhythm. Calm. Unhurried. They made eye contact, not the kind that scans, judges, or imagines. Just a look. Simple. Present. He didn't smile right away. Neither did she. She took the table beside him. A few moments passed, filled with nothing but the soft clinks of cutlery and the low murmur of steam from behind the counter. Then, a voice, gentle, curious. "Have we met before?" "No," he said. "I don't think so." She nodded once, then returned to her tea. No follow-up, no probing, just presence. They exchanged names after some time, brief stories, real ones. He spoke plainly. So did she. They didn't perform for each other. They didn't reach to impress. And when she asked what he did for a living, he said, "I'm still figuring it out." And she didn't flinch. No spark flew. No destiny revealed itself in fireworks. But something unmistakable stirred. A recognition not of image or fantasy but of effort. Of work done. Wounds healed. Shadows faced. She didn't ask him to be anything. She didn't project potential. She didn't correct, guide, or imagine his future. She met him where he was, with no desire to move him. And that was new. When they parted, there was no promise, just mutual acknowledgement. Two people, both whole, neither seeking rescue. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She walked beside it comfortably. Days passed. They met again, and again. Sometimes just for tea. Sometimes not even that. There were no confessions of love, no tests of loyalty. Only two people showing up without masks. One morning, as they walked along the riverbank, she paused and looked at him. Not with hunger, not with need, but with steady clarity. "I don't want to complete you," she said. "I just want to know you." He didn't respond with poetry, just a quiet, grateful, "Thank you." It was the first time he didn't feel like he had to earn anything. She never called him her rock, never called him her everything. And yet she showed up fully, grounded in herself. She had her own fire, her own silence, her own mirror. There was no pedestal, no audition, no script. And standing beside her, he didn't feel chosen. He felt seen. Partners, not prizes. Mirrors, not mothers. Allies, not saviors.